War Dog jumps on his veteran's coffin. Seconds later, the whole funeral is in shock. As the gentle morning breeze rustled the leaves of the towering oak trees lining Arlington National Cemetery, a solemn procession wound its way through the sea of white headstones. At its heart lay a flag-draped coffin, carried by 6 uniformed pallbearers, their steps measured and deliberate. Behind them, a gathering of mourners followed in silent reverence, united in their grief for the man they had come to honor, Sergeant Daniel Hayes. Among the crowd, Daniel's wife, Sarah, walked with their 2 young children, Liam and Emma, their faces etched with sorrow. Beside them, Daniel's parents, Robert and Martha, leaned on each other for support, their eyes glistening with unshed tears. The rest of the mourners consisted of Daniel's fellow veterans, their uniforms adorned with the same medals and ribbons that had once graced Daniel's chest, as well as friends and neighbors from the tight-knit community where the Hayes family had made their home. As the procession neared the gravesite, a mournful whine cut through the somber silence. All eyes turned to the source of the sound, a German shepherd, his fur a patchwork of tan and black, straining against the leash held by one of Daniel's fellow soldiers. It was Max, Daniel's loyal war dog and constant companion, both on the battlefield and in the years that followed. When they reached the grave, the pallbearers gently lowered the coffin onto the platform above the open earth. As the chaplain began to speak, offering words of comfort and praise for Daniel's bravery and sacrifice, Max's whimpers grew louder, his distress palpable. The soldier holding his leash struggled to keep him still, but just as the chaplain was about to conclude the service, Max broke free. In a heartbeat, the dog leaped onto the coffin, his paws scrabbling against the polished wood as he tried to get closer to his beloved handler. A gasp rippled through the gathered mourners, and for a moment, no one moved, transfixed by the raw display of grief and loyalty before them. Sarah was the first to step forward, her hand outstretched to comfort the distraught animal. As her fingers brushed against Max's fur, a realization struck her, as sharp and sudden as a bolt of lightning. Max's behavior was more than just a show of devotion. It was a sign, a message from beyond the grave, urging them to look deeper into the circumstances surrounding Daniel's untimely death. In the days following the funeral, Sarah found herself haunted by Max's actions at the gravesite. As she sat at the kitchen table, sifting through a stack of condolence letters, her mind wandered back to the months leading up to Daniel's passing. He had been struggling, both physically and emotionally, his once vibrant spirit dimmed by the weight of his experiences in the war and the challenges he faced upon returning home. Sarah had watched helplessly as her husband grappled with the bureaucratic maze of the Department of Veterans Affairs, fighting for the benefits and support he so desperately needed. Despite his decorated service record and the visible toll his deployments had taken on his health, Daniel had been met with nothing but obstacles and delays at every turn. As she pondered this, a knock at the door jolted Sarah from her thoughts. Opening it, she found herself face to face with 2 of Daniel's closest friends and fellow veterans, Mike and Lisa. The couple had been a constant source of support for the Hayes family, both during Daniel's deployments and in the aftermath of his death. Over coffee, Sarah shared her growing suspicions with Mike and Lisa, her voice trembling as she recounted Max's behavior at the funeral. "It was like he was trying to tell us something," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "Like he knew there was more to Daniel's death than we realized." Mike and Lisa exchanged a meaningful glance, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Lisa spoke, her voice soft but filled with determination. "We've been hearing rumors," she began, whispers among the veteran community about corruption within the military administration. "Some people are saying that veterans aren't getting the help they need because someone high up is profiting from their suffering." Sarah's heart clenched at the thought, a flicker of anger igniting within her. "If that's true," she said, her jaw set, "then we owe it to Daniel, and to all the other veterans out there, to uncover the truth." As the 3 of them sat there, united in their grief and their resolve, they knew that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. But they also knew that they could not rest until justice was served, not only for Daniel, but for all the brave men and women who had sacrificed so much for their country. Miles away, in a nondescript office building in the heart of Washington, D.C., Colonel Richard Slater sat behind his desk, his brow furrowed as he pored over a stack of documents. As the head of the Department of Veterans Affairs Benefits Division, Slater was responsible for ensuring that the nation's veterans received the support and care they needed to thrive after their service. But beneath the veneer of his prestigious title and polished uniform, Slater harbored a dark secret. For years, he had been siphoning funds from the department, diverting resources meant for struggling veterans into his own pockets and those of his allies. It was a complex web of corruption, carefully concealed behind a facade of bureaucratic red tape and plausible deniability. As he scanned the latest report on veteran benefit claims, a flicker of unease passed over Slater's face. The numbers were growing harder to manipulate, the discrepancies more difficult to explain away. He knew that it was only a matter of time before someone began to ask questions, to pull at the threads of his carefully woven scheme. A sharp knock at the door jolted Slater from his thoughts. "Come in," he barked, hastily shuffling the incriminating documents into a drawer. His secretary, a young woman named Lauren, entered, her face a mask of professionalism despite the late hour. "Sir," she said, her voice clipped and efficient, "I have an update on the Hayes case." The widow was starting to make noise, asking questions about her husband's benefits and treatment. "She's been in contact with some of his old squad members, too." Slater's jaw clenched, a vein throbbing in his temple. The Hayes case had been a thorn in his side from the start, a glaring example of the human cost of his greed. He had denied the sergeant's claims for medical treatment and financial support at every turn, knowing that to approve them would invite scrutiny into his own dealings. "Keep an eye on her," Slater ordered, his voice cold and unyielding. "If she starts to dig too deep, we'll need to take action. We can't afford to let this unravel, not now." Lauren nodded, her eyes flickering with something like regret before she turned and left the office, closing the door softly behind her. Alone once more, Slater leaned back in his chair, his mind racing as he contemplated the growing threat to his empire of deceit. He would stop at nothing to protect his secrets, even if it meant silencing those who dared to stand in his way. Back in the Hayes household, Sarah, Mike, and Lisa huddled around the kitchen table, a sense of urgency hanging heavy in the air. They had spent the past few days reaching out to other veterans and their families, gathering stories and evidence of the widespread neglect and mistreatment they had endured at the hands of the VA. The picture that emerged was one of systemic failure and corruption, a web of deceit that reached the highest levels of the military administration. Countless veterans had been denied the benefits and support they had earned through their service, their pleas for help met with indifference and outright hostility. As they sifted through the mountain of paperwork and testimonials, a name began to surface with alarming frequency: Colonel Richard Slater. The more they dug into his background and dealings, the clearer it became that he was at the center of the scandal, the mastermind behind the misappropriation of funds and resources. Sarah felt a righteous anger building within her, a fire that burned away the fog of grief and despair that had enveloped her since Daniel's death. She knew that seeking justice for her husband and the countless other veterans who had suffered would not be easy, that they would face opposition and intimidation at every turn. But as she looked around the table at Mike and Lisa, at the determination etched into their faces, she knew that they would not back down. They had a duty to the fallen, to those who had given everything in service to their country, to ensure that their sacrifices were not in vain. In that moment, the three of them made a solemn pact, a promise to see their mission through to the end, no matter the cost. They would expose the corruption that had taken root within the VA, would hold those responsible accountable for their actions, and would fight for the rights and dignity of every veteran who had been left behind. As the sun slipped below the horizon, casting the kitchen in a warm, golden glow, Sarah, Mike, and Lisa exchanged a glance, their eyes alight with a shared sense of purpose. They knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with danger, but they also knew that they had each other, a band of warriors united in their quest for truth and justice. The morning sun cast a warm glow across the sprawling grounds of the Arlington Animal Aid Shelter, where Max had been staying since Daniel's passing. Sarah had been visiting him regularly, finding solace in his steadfast presence and the memories of her husband that he evoked. As she walked through the kennels, Sarah couldn't help but marvel at the resilience and spirit of the animals around her. Each one had a story, a history of hardship and abandonment, yet they still managed to greet each day with wagging tails and hopeful eyes. She found Max in his usual spot, curled up on a soft bed in the corner of his kennel. At the sound of her footsteps, his ears perked up, and he bounded over to her, his tail swishing back and forth in eager anticipation. Sarah knelt down, burying her face in Max's thick fur as he nuzzled against her, his warm breath tickling her cheek. In that moment, she felt a surge of gratitude for the loyal companion who had been by Daniel's side through the darkest of times, who had refused to leave him even in death. As she sat with Max, the other volunteers and staff went about their daily routines, feeding and cleaning and playing with the shelter's residents. Sarah couldn't help but be struck by the sense of community and purpose that permeated the place, the way that people from all walks of life had come together to care for these vulnerable creatures. It was a reminder, she thought, of the power of unity and compassion, the way that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward, changing lives and forging bonds that could weather any storm. With a final pat, Sarah rose to her feet, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. She knew that the fight ahead would be daunting, that there would be moments when the darkness threatened to overwhelm her. But here, in this place of healing and hope, she had found a glimmer of light, a reminder of the goodness that still existed in the world. As she made her way out of the shelter, Sarah's steps were imbued with a newfound sense of purpose, a determination to honor Daniel's memory by fighting for the justice he had been denied. She knew that Max would be by her side every step of the way, a living embodiment of the loyalty and courage that had defined her husband's life. Across town, in a small, unassuming office, Mike and Lisa pored over a stack of documents, their brows furrowed in concentration. They had spent the past week making inquiries and gathering information, piecing together the puzzle of Colonel Slater's misdeeds. It had been a painstaking process, a game of cat and mouse as they navigated the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the VA, chasing down leads and cultivating sources. But slowly, steadily, a picture had begun to emerge, a tapestry of corruption and deceit that stretched back years. As they sifted through the evidence, Mike and Lisa couldn't help but feel a growing sense of outrage, a simmering anger at the injustice that had been allowed to fester for so long. They thought of Daniel, of the countless other veterans who had been left to suffer in silence, their pleas for help falling on deaf ears. But they also felt a flicker of hope, a glimmer of possibility that they could make a difference, that their efforts could bring about real change. They knew that they were up against powerful forces, that Slater and his allies would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Yet they also knew that they were not alone, that there were others out there who shared their commitment to truth and justice. They thought of Sarah, of the unwavering strength and resolve she had shown in the face of unimaginable grief, and they drew courage from her example. As the hours ticked by, Mike and Lisa worked tirelessly, their minds sharp and their spirits unbowed. They exchanged ideas and strategies, poring over documents and connecting the dots, a sense of camaraderie and shared purpose binding them together. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the office in a warm, orange glow, they knew that they were on the cusp of something big, that the pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. They could feel the momentum building, the tide turning in their favor, and they knew that they would not rest until they had exposed the truth and brought those responsible to justice. Days turned into weeks as Sarah, Mike, and Lisa worked tirelessly to uncover the extent of Colonel Slater's corruption. They had gathered a mountain of evidence, a damning indictment of the greed and callousness that had infected the highest levels of the VA. But they knew that evidence alone would not be enough, that they would need to build a groundswell of support to rally the community behind their cause. They reached out to other veterans groups and advocacy organizations, forging alliances and sharing information, a network of resistance taking shape. They organized meetings and rallies, giving voice to the stories of those who had been left behind, shining a light on the injustices that had been allowed to fester in the shadows. They spoke of Daniel, of his bravery and sacrifice, of the way he had been failed by the very system he had fought to defend. And as word spread, as more and more people joined their cause, Sarah, Mike, and Lisa could feel the tide beginning to turn, a sense of momentum building that could not be stopped. They knew that they were on the cusp of something big, that their efforts were finally bearing fruit. But even as they savored the small victories, the moments of hope and progress, they knew that the road ahead would be long and arduous. They steeled themselves for the backlash that was sure to come, for the attempts to discredit and silence them. For Sarah, the fight had taken on a deeply personal meaning, a quest to honor her husband's memory and ensure that his death had not been in vain. She thought of Max, of the unwavering loyalty he had shown to Daniel, and she knew that she could do no less. As she stood before a crowd of veterans and their families, her voice ringing out with passion and conviction, Sarah could feel the weight of their hopes and dreams upon her shoulders. She knew that she was not just fighting for Daniel, but for all of them, for the countless others who had been left to suffer in silence. And in that moment, as the crowd erupted in cheers and applause, Sarah knew that she was not alone, that she was part of something bigger than herself. She could feel the power of unity, the strength that comes from standing together in the face of adversity. She knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, that there would be setbacks and obstacles at every turn. But she also knew that she had the love and support of those around her, that together, they could weather any storm. As the weeks turned into months, Colonel Slater began to feel the walls closing in around him. The whispers of discontent had grown to a roar, a chorus of voices demanding accountability and justice. He had tried to stem the tide, to silence the critics and discredit the accusers, but it was like trying to hold back the ocean with a sieve. The evidence of his misdeeds was mounting, a damning indictment of the corrupt system he had helped to create. Slater knew that he was running out of time, that the noose was tightening around his neck. He had always prided himself on his ability to stay one step ahead, to outmaneuver his opponents and protect his interests. But now, as he sat in his office, the weight of his sins bearing down upon him, he could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. He knew that he would have to act quickly, to take drastic measures to preserve his power and position. He thought of the Hayes family, of the widow who had dared to challenge him, to expose the rot at the heart of the VA. He had underestimated her, had dismissed her as just another grieving wife, a nuisance to be swatted away. But Sarah Hayes had proved to be a formidable adversary, a woman of unwavering conviction and determination. She had rallied the community behind her, had shone a light on the dark corners of the system, exposing the ugly truth for all to see. Slater knew that he could not let her succeed, that he would have to crush her and her allies, to send a message that dissent would not be tolerated. As the pressure mounted on Colonel Slater, Sarah, Mike, and Lisa knew that they were entering the most critical phase of their campaign. They had built a powerful coalition, a network of supporters and allies who were committed to seeing justice done. But they also knew that Slater would not go down without a fight, that he would use every tool at his disposal to protect his interests and silence his critics. They had to be prepared for the backlash, for the attempts to intimidate and discredit them. Sarah found herself at the center of the storm, the public face of the movement for change. She gave interviews and speeches, telling her story and the stories of countless other veterans and their families who had been left behind by the system. She spoke of the sacrifices they had made, of the scars they bore both visible and invisible, and of the duty owed to them by a nation that had sent them into harm's way. She spoke of Daniel, of his bravery and his struggles, and of the way he had been failed by the very institution he had served. And as she spoke, Sarah could feel the power of her words, the way they resonated with people from all walks of life. She could see the tears in the eyes of the veterans who listened to her, the nods of recognition and the murmurs of agreement. She knew that she was giving voice to their pain and their hopes, that she was channeling the collective yearning for justice and accountability. And she drew strength from their support, from the knowledge that she was not alone in this fight. But even as the movement gained momentum, Sarah knew that the real test was yet to come. She knew that Slater would not surrender easily, that he would fight tooth and nail to hold onto his power and privilege. She steeled herself for the battle ahead, for the long days and sleepless nights, for the moments of doubt and despair. But she also knew that she had the love and support of those around her, that together, they could overcome any obstacle. And so, with a sense of purpose and determination, Sarah and her allies pressed on, their eyes fixed on the horizon, their hearts filled with hope for a brighter future. As the weeks passed, the tension between Colonel Slater and the veterans' rights movement reached a breaking point. Slater had used every trick in his playbook to try to undermine and discredit his opponents, but nothing seemed to be working. The evidence of his corruption was too overwhelming, the voices of dissent too loud to be silenced. He could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet, the walls closing in around him. In a last-ditch effort to save himself, Slater decided to take a more direct approach. He began to target Sarah and her allies personally, using his connections and influence to make their lives a living hell. He had their phones tapped, their emails hacked, their every move watched and scrutinized. He spread rumors and lies about them, trying to paint them as radicals and troublemakers, a threat to the very fabric of society. But Sarah and her team refused to be intimidated. They knew that they were on the right side of history, that they were fighting for a cause greater than themselves. They drew strength from each other, from the knowledge that they were not alone in this struggle. And then, just when it seemed that all hope was lost, a breakthrough came from the most unlikely of places. Max, the loyal war dog who had refused to leave his handler's side, even in death, proved to be the key to unlocking the truth. In a hidden compartment in Daniel's old military gear, Sarah and her team found a document that would change everything. It was a smoking gun, a piece of evidence that tied Colonel Slater directly to the misallocation of veteran benefits and the cover-up that had followed. With this new information in hand, Sarah and her allies knew that they had the upper hand. They went public with their findings, holding press conferences and rallies, demanding that Slater be held accountable for his crimes. The response was electric. Veterans and their families came out in droves to support the cause, joined by ordinary citizens who were outraged by the injustice that had been allowed to fester for so long. And as the pressure mounted, as the calls for justice grew louder and more insistent, Colonel Slater began to crack. He knew that his time was running out, that the truth would soon come to light. In a moment of desperation, he made a fatal mistake. He tried to flee, to escape the consequences of his actions. But it was too late. The net had closed around him, and there was nowhere left to run. The day of reckoning had finally arrived. Colonel Richard Slater stood before a packed courtroom, his once proud bearing reduced to a slouch of defeat. He had been arrested and charged with a litany of crimes, from embezzlement and fraud to abuse of power and obstruction of justice. As the proceedings began, the evidence against him was laid out in damning detail. The document found by Sarah and her team was the centerpiece, the smoking gun that tied Slater directly to the misallocation of veteran benefits. But it was not the only piece of evidence. As the trial unfolded, a parade of witnesses took the stand, each one painting a picture of a man consumed by greed and ambition, willing to sacrifice the well-being of those he had sworn to serve for his own personal gain. There were the veterans who had been denied the care and support they needed, left to suffer in silence while Slater lined his pockets with the funds meant for their treatment. There were the whistleblowers who had tried to speak out, only to be silenced and punished for their efforts. And then there was Max, the loyal war dog whose actions had set the wheels of justice in motion. As Sarah took the stand to tell his story, the courtroom fell silent, hanging on her every word. She spoke of the bond between Max and Daniel, of the love and devotion that had sustained them through the darkest of times. She spoke of the way Max had refused to leave his handler's side, even in death, and of the message he had sent from beyond the grave. As she finished her testimony, Sarah could feel the weight of the moment, the sense that something momentous was happening. She looked out at the sea of faces before her, at the veterans and their families, at the ordinary citizens who had come to bear witness to this historic day. And in that moment, she knew that they had won. The truth had been revealed, the corrupt system exposed for all to see. Colonel Slater would pay for his crimes, and the veterans who had been left behind would finally receive the justice and support they deserved. As the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Sarah felt a rush of emotion, a sense of relief and vindication that brought tears to her eyes. She thought of Daniel, of the sacrifices he had made, and she knew that he would be proud of what they had accomplished. But she also knew that the fight was not over, that there was still work to be done. The system that had failed so many veterans would need to be rebuilt from the ground up, with accountability and transparency at its core. And so, as she stepped out of the courtroom and into the bright sunlight of a new day, Sarah felt a sense of purpose and determination wash over her. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she also knew that she was not alone. With Max by her side, and the love and support of her fellow veterans and their families, Sarah knew that anything was possible. Together, they would build a better future, one in which the sacrifices of those who served would never be forgotten or taken for granted again. In the weeks and months following Colonel Slater's conviction, a sense of change and renewal swept through the veteran community. The corrupt system that had failed so many was being dismantled piece by piece, replaced by a new model of care and support that put the needs of veterans first. At the heart of this transformation was Sarah and her team, who had become the de facto leaders of the movement for change. They worked tirelessly to implement new policies and programs to ensure that every veteran received the care and support they needed to thrive. They established a network of community centers and support groups, places where veterans could come together to share their stories and draw strength from one another. They fought for increased funding for mental health services and job training programs, knowing that these were the keys to helping veterans rebuild their lives after service. And through it all, Max remained a constant presence, a symbol of the enduring bond between veterans and their loyal companions. He became a mascot of sorts, a reminder of the sacrifices that had been made and the importance of never giving up, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. As the months turned into years, Sarah watched with pride as the seeds they had planted began to bear fruit. She saw veterans who had once been lost and alone find purpose and connection, saw families who had been torn apart by the trauma of war begin to heal and rebuild. She knew that there was still much work to be done, that the fight for justice and equity was an ongoing struggle. But she also knew that they had made a difference, that they had changed the course of history in ways both big and small. And so, as she looked out over the sea of faces before her, Sarah felt a sense of hope and possibility that she had never known before. She saw in their eyes the same determination and resilience that had carried her through the darkest of times, and she knew that together they could overcome anything. With Max by her side, and the love and support of her fellow veterans and their families, Sarah knew that the future was bright. They had fought for justice, and they had won. And now, they would continue to fight, to ensure that the sacrifices of those who served would never be forgotten, and that every veteran would receive the care and support they needed to thrive. Years passed, and the legacy of Daniel Hayes and his loyal war dog Max lived on. Their story had become a touchstone for the veteran community, a reminder of the power of love, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between human and animal. Sarah had become a leader in her own right, a tireless advocate for the rights and well-being of veterans and their families. She had taken the pain and loss of her own experience and transformed it into a force for good, a catalyst for change that had touched countless lives. And Max, the hero who had started it all, had become a legend in his own time. His story was told and retold, passed down from one generation of veterans to the next. He was a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always a light to guide the way. As Sarah looked back on the journey that had brought her to this moment, she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and gratitude. She had seen the worst of humanity, had witnessed firsthand the corruption and greed that had infected the highest levels of power. But she had also seen the best of humanity, the courage and compassion that had carried them through the storm. She had seen ordinary people come together to fight for what was right, to stand up for those who had been left behind. And now, as she stood before a crowd of veterans and their families, Sarah knew that their work was not finished. There were still battles to be fought, still injustices to be righted. But she also knew that they had the strength and the will to see it through. As she looked out over the sea of faces before her, Sarah felt a sense of pride and purpose that filled her heart to bursting. She saw in their eyes the same love and devotion that had burned so brightly in Daniel's, and she knew that his spirit lived on in each and every one of them. And so, with Max by her side, and the love and support of her fellow veterans and their families, Sarah stepped forward into the future, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They had fought for justice, and they had won. And now, they would continue to fight, to honor the sacrifices of those who had served, and to build a better world for all who followed in their footsteps. As the sun set on another day, Sarah made her way through the quiet streets of Arlington National Cemetery, the same path she had walked so many times before. She had come to visit Daniel's grave, to share with him the triumphs and struggles of the past few years. As she knelt before the headstone, Max at her side, Sarah felt a sense of peace and contentment wash over her. She knew that Daniel was with her always, that his love and strength would continue to guide her, no matter where the road ahead might lead. She thought back to the day of his funeral, to the moment when Max had leapt onto his coffin in a final act of devotion. She remembered the shock and disbelief that had rippled through the crowd, the sense that something profound and transformative had just taken place. And she knew now, with the benefit of hindsight, that Max's actions had set in motion a chain of events that had changed the course of history. He had been the catalyst, the spark that had ignited a movement for justice and accountability that had swept across the nation. As Sarah rose to her feet, she felt a renewed sense of purpose and determination. She knew that the fight for veterans' rights was far from over, that there was still so much work to be done. But she also knew that she was not alone, that she had the love and support of a community that would never give up, never back down. And so, with Max at her side, Sarah turned her face to the setting sun, ready to face the challenges of a new day. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, that there would be setbacks and obstacles at every turn. But she also knew that they would prevail, that the spirit of Daniel Hayes and the countless other veterans who had sacrificed so much would continue to inspire and guide them. They had fought for justice, and they had won. And now, they would continue to fight, to build a better future for all who followed in their footsteps. As the last rays of sunlight danced across the cemetery, Sarah felt a sense of hope and possibility that she had never known before. She knew that the legacy of Daniel Hayes would live on, that his memory would continue to inspire and guide them, no matter where the road ahead might lead. And with Max by her side, and the love and support of a grateful nation, Sarah stepped forward into the future, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They had fought for justice, and they had won. And now, they would continue to fight, to honor the sacrifices of those who had served, and to build a better world for all who followed in their wake.